the destruction of Thebes and the rise of Alexander. When the first Macedonian banners appeared outside Thebes, most of us still thought the city could hold. We had heard the rumors too, the kind that move faster than armies. Alexander was dead somewhere in the north, his rule fragile, his grip on Greece slipping. Inside the walls, men spoke openly of revolt, and some believed other Greek cities would rise with us. Then the dust on the road thickened, and the speed of Alexander's march made the rumor look foolish. He had crossed into Greece before our hopes could spread. By the time we understood what was coming, Thebes was no longer making a political stand. It was fighting for its life. I was in Thebes in 335 BCE, and I remember how the city felt before the fighting started. Restless, proud, and badly divided. Philip of Macedon had been dead only a year, murdered at Aegi, and his son Alexander had taken the throne young, and suddenly, in Greece, that transition mattered. Philip had forced most of the city-states into obedience, but obedience is not the same as loyalty. Thebanen remembered old power. They remembered when Thebes had been the leading force in Boeotia, not a city living under Macedonian pressure. So when word spread that Alexander was far away in the north, and perhaps dead, people began to talk as if the moment had finally come. The talk was not only in the streets. It reached the council, the gymnasia, the gates. Anti-Macedonian feeling had never disappeared, and now it found a new shape. The exact role of other Greek cities in encouraging us is hard to pin down, even now, but the mood was real enough. Some men believed Athens and others would follow if Thebes struck first. Others just wanted to test whether Macedon could still command fear after Philip's death. The rumor of Alexander's death, whether true or not, gave the rebellion a spark. In a city like Thebes, that was enough. We knew the risks. Macedonian authority in Greece rested on more than words. It rested on hostages, alliances, garrisons, and the memory of what Philip had done to those who resisted him. But confidence can be loud when no army is in sight. The decision to rebel came fast. It was a dangerous gamble, but it made sense to men who thought Alexander was delayed, distracted, or dead. If Greece was going to shake off Macedonian rule, Thebes had to move before fear returned. Then the reports changed. Alexander was not dead. He was moving. He marched from the north with astonishing speed, using the roads and passes before the revolt could spread into a wider war. That was what frightened us most. He did not wait for hesitation to work in his favor. He came straight into Greece and arrived before the anti-Macedonian cities could coordinate. For all the talk in Thebes, we had not prepared for an enemy who could respond that quickly. When Alexander reached central Greece, the city suddenly felt exposed. His approach was not a slow siege line or a distant negotiation. It was a hard, direct warning. He had with him Macedonian infantry, including the men of the phalanx, and enough cavalry to make any open ground dangerous. He also came backed by the political authority his father had built through force. That mattered as much as the troops. Every Greek city could see what Thebes was now facing. Not a wounded boy king, but a ruler who understood that delay would only invite more rebellion. The first thing everyone noticed was the pressure on the gates and walls. Thebes was strong, but no city likes to wait while an enemy gathers around it. Our defenders watched the approaches closely, trying to judge where the Macedonians would press hardest. The terrain around Thebes offered some room for movement, but not enough to make a bad decision harmless. Once Alexander was near, the roads into and out of the city became dangerous. Supply movement slowed. Messengers became less certain. Men who had spoken boldly a few days earlier began asking whether Athens would actually come, whether help would arrive, whether the story about Alexander's death had been just that, a story. He gave us little time to answer. Alexander's presence alone changed the balance. He wanted the rebellion crushed before it could ignite the rest of Greece, and he moved as if he meant it. That speed was part of the battle. By the time we understood that our revolt had not spread, we were already trapped inside our own decision. Fighting began in a way that felt almost unreal. There was no long, clean opening, no formal courage placed neatly in rows. Instead, there was movement at the walls, pressure on the approaches, shouted orders, and the ugly confusion that comes when a city realizes it is being taken seriously by an enemy far stronger than it expected. Macedonian troops advanced with discipline. The phalanx was the center of that force, pikes leveled, shields tight, forcing our defenders to hold ground that became harder to keep by the minute. Cavalry threatened the flanks wherever the terrain allowed it, and the defenders could not treat any section of the line as safe for long. I remember the sound most clearly. Not a single clash, but many at once. Men shouting over one another. Wood striking wood. Stones thrown from the walls. The sharp, metallic scrape of weapons shifting in cramped spaces. Dust rose where the fighting churned the ground, and it made it difficult to know whether a gap in the line was a real breach or only confusion. At first, some of us still believed the city could absorb the attack. The walls were there. The gates were held. Men moved where they were told. But then came the turning point, and it was sudden enough to make all the earlier confidence feel foolish. A section of the defense broke under sustained pressure, and once that happened, the battle stopped being a contest over a wall and became a struggle inside the city itself. That is when everything changed. Alexander's men were no longer simply outside Thebes. They were in it. Once the Macedonians forced their way in, the fight spread street by street. That kind of battle does not stay orderly for long. Phalanx men, heavy and tightly packed, were powerful in open pushing matches, but inside a city the streets narrowed, and the fighting turned brutal in a practical, desperate sense. Men could no longer rely on distance or formation. Doors, corners, walls, and alleys all mattered. The defenders tried to regroup at familiar points, but each withdrawal gave the attackers more room to advance. I saw men dragged down near doorways. I saw neighbors trying to carry the wounded while the next street was already lost. The Macedonians pushed toward key spaces, and once they held them, the rest of the city began to unravel. The goal was not only to defeat the fighters in front of them, but to break the city's ability to organize any defense at all. That is how a battle becomes a collapse. What happened to Thebes after that was even worse than the fighting. Ancient accounts say the city was largely destroyed, and I believed it as I watched the fire and wreckage spread. Houses were broken open. Some people fled where they could, but many were cut off. Others were taken captive. The numbers reported later: killed, enslaved, displaced. Very too much to trust exactly, but no one in Thebes needed an exact count to understand the scale. Families were separated. Survivors were gathered under guard. A city that had once spoken with pride about its place in Greece was being reduced to an example. The destruction had a political purpose as clear as any order on the battlefield. Alexander wanted every Greek city to see what resistance meant. The fall of Thebes was not a local affair once the walls were breached. It became a message carried across Greece faster than any messenger could ride. Athens, Sparta, and the smaller states watched and understood that Macedonian power had not weakened with Philip's death. If anything, it had become more dangerous because Alexander was young, fast, and determined to prove himself. For those of us inside Thebes, the aftermath came in stages. First, the silence after the fighting, which was not peace but exhaustion. Then the sight of captives being led away. Then the realization that whole sections of the city would not recover. Ancient writers disagree on the exact scale, and they may have exaggerated some figures, but they all agree on the point that mattered. Thebes was broken. What survived of the city survived, because Alexander chose to spare enough of it to make the warning more useful. And that warning worked. The destruction of Thebes ended the chance of a broad Greek uprising before Alexander turned east toward Persia. The other city-states saw what had happened and measured their own risks again. Thebes had rebelled on the hope that Macedonian control could be shaken at a critical moment. Instead, the revolt showed how quickly Alexander could move, how decisively he could strike, and how far he was willing to go to secure his position. I left Thebes with the smell of smoke in my clothes, and the knowledge that the city's fate had already become larger than the city itself. In a single campaign, Alexander had faced his first major crisis as king, and answered it with speed, force, and warning. After that, no Greek state could doubt that his rule had been established. The road to Asia was still ahead of him, but Greece had already learned the lesson he intended to teach. Resistance would not merely be defeated, it could be erased. The fall of Thebes secured Alexander's rule in Greece, and announced the force behind his empire.